when I say the 40-day phenomenon, I mean on day X, 2 students are killed, and then there's one mourning period, I think 7 days afterwards, but then the big one comes 40 days after the death.
Right.
And then there are more demonstrations, and then more people are killed, and then 40 days from that there's another demonstration. So you begin to have these affairs getting cumulative and getting bigger in terms of their impact on the society. If he had still stopped that in October, I think he could have saved the situation. But when he showed inconsistency in his policy and showed that he wasn't sure what he wanted to do, he first sort of said, well, I'll loosen up a bit because that's what the U.S. wants me to do, so I'll let 1,000 flowers bloom and let some new parties come along and so on. And then there were problems, and then he cracked down, and then in Tebris, Osmodeh was under orders to control the bazaar, so he acted tough and some people were killed, and then the Shah dismissed him, and it appeared that he felt that he'd gone too far. You know, it was inconsistent the way he handled affairs from one day to the next, and I think that's when people sort of sensed that he wasn't able to consistently follow any particular line, and that his hold was weakening on the country. Had he been consistent in October and said, no, you know, a little bit of dissent is all right if it's just oral and, you know, ideas fermenting, but I'm not going to allow any demonstrations, and had put several down even with some force, I think he could have saved the situation. But once he got beyond that time, then no.
Although he added in September the so-called Black Friday incidents at the square in Tehran.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one example where extreme force was applied.
Yeah, that's right.
It didn't.
But
it exacerbated the situation, I think, and it increased tensions, it seems.
Was it in the Hauser book when he talks about that? I think it was that after that.
Square I'm talking about in September.
Yeah, after that incident, there was a period of calm for a number of days, while people sort of looked around as, you know, wondering, is this the new tough policy, or? And then when no further direction was given, no further indication of policy, then people started sort of scurrying around again. And there was a whole period of indecision there, I think, which people sensed during all that time, that he wasn't really sure whether to be tough or to be lenient. And I believe that people would have complained bitterly, but they would have, you know, knuckled under and gone back to their old ways of just talking the discontent among each other, but not doing anything about it. But you know, it's academic in a sense, because let's face it, the man by then was having the effects of cancer, and people talk about the personality changes that cancer brings on. You know, people are up one day and down the next, and I think he was suffering from that problem right at this time. That he you know, one day he wanted to be tough, next day he said he couldn't remain a Shah if it meant doing so at the expense of thousands of lost lives and so on. So I think he just was in his own mind unclear what he should do. And he couldn't get advice. See, that was the thing. The whole way he'd operated before was always that he was the ultimate authority. And if he asked one of his subordinates, should I do this or that, they would always just defer to whatever way they thought he wanted to go. You know, they just never wanted to give him any, maybe there were one or two exceptions, but, you know, almost everybody just said, oh, you're wise. Your Majesty is so wise. What you've decided is just the best thing you could possibly have done. You know, he couldn't turn anyone and say, now, what do I really do to get myself out of this jam and get clear advice? There was no one to do that.
Okay, well, one final question. This is by way of conclusion. In his book, James Bull concludes in part that Iran-American relations represented both a failure of policy and a failure of intelligence. Failure of intelligence in the sense that he says that Americans never really understood properly Iranian political culture, and a failure of policy in the sense that policymakers refused to recognize the Shah's vulnerabilities. To what extent, to some extent, you've already answered that question, but do you want to give a little bit more time to that question?
Well, I guess in a sense my position is already known because Jim Bill mentions in one of his footnotes there that, referring to me, that an embassy officer who's too protective of his own embassy says that, the reports did go in and it's a failure on the Washington end to act on them. I still have to feel that way and I can point to these reports. I mean, I can say the White Revolution in Iran, this report on decision making in Iran, the report on the Rastafi's party, the political dynamics paper of much earlier. I can cite instance after instance where we reported the facts as they were clear to us and the trends and what they meant. But what happened to those reports? They just were read by a few people back in Washington and signed off and put them in their outbox, and someone put them in the files, and that's all that was done. Policy often was made by some junior officer on the desk writing a toast. I mean, this is a typical activity for an officer on the desk, Carter's going to visit Tehran, so maybe 3 months in advance some guy is sitting down preparing a briefing book, among which is a toast that the president's going to read at the night of the banquet given by the Shah for the visiting American president. And some junior officer sits down and writes out what he thinks the president ought to say. And then maybe he writes something that's fairly full of praise, but maybe a little bit balanced. And then maybe his country director adds to the flowery language and make it sound more effusive to pay homage to his host. In the end, the toast that comes out is just so flowery that it's embarrassing. And that makes policy, because people who hear that say, well, that's American policy. That toast has just expressed American policy. So maybe, 200 times as many words have been sent in to Washington telling them exactly what's happening in the country, but they're all ignored because this one toast becomes policy. That's when the American president says this to the Shah at a big banquet. It's reported all over the world and all over Iran. This is American policy. The Americans are totally backing the Shah, and they see nothing else in the country besides the Shah. The man who's accomplished so much, has led his country into democracy, and everything as if it's all done. It's all an accomplished fact that Iran is now run by a benevolent dictator who's brought democracy and the White Revolution to Iran. So, I wouldn't be able to say that we sent in the reports if I couldn't show you, but I can show you not the ones we discussed here, but more in my file upstairs, and more that other colleagues have sent in over the years. It's there, but it was overruled many times, or just ignored, put aside, and the policy was made by so many other people sitting in Washington who did not draw on all this information. And the reason is because at the time when something comes up, all they have to go on is what's available right at that moment. No one's going to take the time to go back in the files and dig out, 5 airgrams that really give a whole factual picture. They're just going to talk to somebody and they'll make a quick policy statement or toast or whatever, and that becomes policy at that time. So that's why I say it's a failure, not of intelligence, not of reporting from the field, but a failure of policy in Washington.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for your time.
Okay.